How about if we all just take a minute to rummage through the pockets of our hearts and minds and see how many doubts you and I have brought to church with us this morning. Doubts about God, about who God is, doubts about what God does, what God doesn't do in our lives, doubts about the church and its teaching, its authority in our lives, doubts about the Bible, the Scriptures, doubts about Jesus and the Holy Spirit, where they are, even if they are in our lives. Doubts about what's right and what's wrong, and who's to tell us the difference. Doubts about how we're supposed to live our lives, and doubts about life after death. If we really do a little rummaging, I doubt that many of us are doubt-free. We just heard the story of doubting Thomas. In spite of his closest friends having told him that they had seen Jesus who had risen from the dead, Thomas's doubt was deep enough to lead him to say, "I won't believe unless." Doubt is defined as uncertainty. Uncertainty about the truth, the reality, or the nature of something. Uncertainty. Maybe this is true. Maybe it's not. Perhaps this is real. Is it all imagined? Could this be exactly what we're supposed to believe and do? Or does it make any difference at all? Uncertainty. Doubt. We live in a world which warns us in so many ways, don't believe unless. Don't believe unless it can be proved, unless it can be weighed, examined, explained, unless it can be reduced to the capacity of the human mind to grasp it in its entirety. Of course, if we lived our lives by those demands, we would never fall in love. We would never be able to hope for what we've not yet seen or experienced, to hope for what we don't understand. If we demanded proof for everything, we'd be unable to trust anyone or anything, even those right within our sight, our reach, our grasp. We'd never be able to discern what beauty is, or bother to seek out or delight in what attracts us. If we always required proof, we'd cease to imagine, to hope, to dream for anything beyond the here and now, for anything beyond our immediate apprehension. But the human spirit thirsts for love and hungers for beauty. It yearns for what is not yet, what is yet to be, what might be, what we hope will be, what we cannot yet and perhaps never will be able to test or weigh or prove. And the human spirit in the heart of a Christian thirsts for that love that never fails, hungers for that beauty that does not age or fade, and longs achingly for so much more than can be imagined or wished or even prayed for, let alone what can be scientifically and intellectually discovered and discerned and dissected. It's not that Thomas couldn't believe or that he wouldn't believe. Rather, he chose not to believe. He chose to doubt unless he could examine and probe the nail marks in Jesus' hands and the wound in his side. But Jesus does not turn away from the doubter. Jesus does not turn away from you and me when we doubt. He didn't chastise Thomas. He didn't reprimand or reject Thomas. Rather, Jesus invited Thomas to an intimacy even greater than what he had already shared with the other apostles. He invites Thomas to probe his crucified, risen self and to believe. Jesus renders himself vulnerable to Thomas, inviting him to touch his wounded, risen body. So perhaps there are some questions here this morning for the doubters among us, and I'm one of those. Isn't it true that I hunger and thirst and long for realities that I cannot prove beyond a doubt? Is my heart not continually drawn to a love so deep that it could only come from a source I cannot prove? Does my soul not ache for beauty that only the divine might satisfy? A divinity in which I'm invited to believe, but cannot prove. Do I not yearn for a life where all is peace and joy, where all are healed and reconciled? Do I not long in my heart of hearts for heaven, a place I've never seen, whose existence I cannot prove, whose reality is precisely something I can only believe in? Whatever my doubts and uncertainties might be, I know for sure that my humanity hungers and thirsts and longs for something so much more than what my human mind can prove, for something that could only come from God, whom I have never seen, for something alive in my hope and desire, and yet totally beyond my comprehension. It's helpful to recognize it in the gospel story Jeff just read for us. Although Jesus invites Thomas to probe his wounds, we're not told if Thomas did or didn't do that. Thomas gave himself again in love to Jesus. He came to believe not on account of examined proof, but in response to the voice of Jesus calling him to trust beyond anything Thomas's mind and heart could know or hold or touch or understand. Jesus does the same thing for you and me this morning, who rummage through our hearts and minds and find a handful of doubts there. Jesus invites you and me not only to reach out and touch him, but even to consume him, to take him into ourselves in the bread of the Eucharist, to take in the very love, the beauty, and the truth for which we hunger and thirst, long and hope, and cannot prove. Help us, risen Jesus. Help us to trust and believe and to pray with Thomas, my Lord and my God.